Welcome to Boring History, where forgotten nights, silent rituals, and ancient whispers come alive once more. Close your eyes and imagine the soft glow of oil lamps, the faint fragrance of papyrus and parchment, and the quiet rustle of scrolls shifting in the stillness. This was more than a building, it was a sanctuary of memory. Within these walls, devoted keepers moved gently through the night, tending words that outlasted empires. Tonight, we drift back into their world, into the hushed lives of ancient librarians who, in their silence, shaped the very foundations of history. As the day fades into quiet shadow, the halls of ancient libraries take on a character of their own, no longer bustling with footsteps of visitors or the murmured voices of scholars. Instead, they are filled with a softer rhythm, a kind of hushed breathing, as if the very walls have settled into a nightly meditation. The librarians, those unseen caretakers of knowledge, move slowly through the dim corridors, their tasks unremarkable on the surface, yet deeply woven into the fabric of history. They did not expect glory, nor did they seek fame. Their work was patient, repetitive, almost invisible. And yet, in their nightly routines, there lies a story as calm as candlelight and as steady as the passage of time. The day's last readers had long departed, leaving behind the faint smell of parchment and the lingering memory of rustling pages. Dust motes floated lazily in the shafts of evening light that slipped through high windows, catching the air like a silent snowfall. The librarians began their evening rounds, not hurried, never hurried, for their pace was as measured as the ticking of water clocks or the burning of oil lamps. One might see them adjusting scrolls upon shelves, ensuring that papyrus did not bend or crack, that bindings of leather stayed free from dampness, that ink remained safe from the creeping hand of time. This was not dramatic labor. It was the steady tending of fragile vessels, the quiet custodianship of memory itself. In the great libraries of antiquity, whether in Athens or Alexandria, in distant monasteries or desert scriptoria, the nightly routine of a librarian often began with the extinguishing of noise. Heavy doors were closed with a groan, wooden bars drawn into place. The echo of footsteps diminished until only a handful of figures remained. Then lamps were trimmed, small flames flickered, shadows lengthened, and the great rooms of knowledge seemed to stretch further into silence. By day, a library might be a hive of curiosity. By night, it became a temple of slowness. Every sound carried meaning. The creak of wood, the flutter of a turning page, the faint cough of a keeper. It was all amplified in the stillness, becoming part of a nightly ritual older than memory. The librarians were not merely keepers of books, they were guardians of order. Each volume, each scroll, each tablet of clay had its place, and it was their duty to ensure nothing fell astray. To the untrained eye, this was dull work, moving bundles of parchment, adjusting wooden trays, wrapping textiles around delicate bindings. But for those who lived within the rhythm of this labor, it was closer to meditation. They would glide their hands softly along the edges of manuscripts, feeling for frayed threads, smoothing folds of vellum, brushing away the day's dust with careful cloth. One could almost imagine that the manuscripts sighed under their touch, grateful for the care, for the nightly reassurance that they were still alive within the dark. And always, there was the matter of fire. Fire was both a servant and a threat. Without it, one could not read in the dim light of evening. With too much of it, one risked destruction. Thus, part of the nightly ritual was the tending of lamps. Oil was measured with precision, wicks cut evenly, flames shielded by glass or bronze. A careless flame might undo centuries of labor, so the keepers moved with caution, their eyes trained on every flicker. Some libraries had special alcoves built of stone, where flames could be kept safely, and every night the librarians would walk the halls, checking each niche, each lamp, each ember until their minds were eased. They did not leave until the balance between light and safety was assured. In some corners of the ancient world, librarians performed small prayers as they closed their work. Not prayers for themselves, but for the knowledge they tended. A whispered word to the gods of memory, a bow of the head to the muses, a soft invocation to keep ink from fading. It was not unusual for a monk or a scribe to kiss the cover of a manuscript before placing it back upon a shelf, as if sealing it with reverence before sleep. Others tied soft cloth around scrolls, binding them gently like children being tucked into bed. Each action was repeated night after night, until the very routine became a form of devotion, an unspoken pact between human and history. When all was set in order, the librarians often took time to walk the rows in silence. To us, it might seem strange to wander through dark halls where only the faint outlines of shelves could be seen, where the scent of wax and dust hung in the air, where silence pressed gently against the ear. But to them, it was a kind of companionship. They knew each collection intimately, the familiar tilt of a shelf, the faint tear in a binding, the peculiar weight of a scroll in the hand. To walk the aisles at night was to be surrounded not by emptiness, but by presence. Presence of the past, presence of wisdom, presence of those who had written and those who had read. It was a stillness heavy with unseen company. Outside, the world was never fully quiet. Winds brushed against stone walls, the call of night birds echoed, sometimes distant footsteps lingered on cobbled streets. But inside, the rhythm was slower. The librarians, perhaps 2 or 3 in number on a given night, often spoke little. When they did, their voices were hushed, words chosen sparingly. A question about a misplaced scroll, a reminder about a brittle parchment, a suggestion to check the north shelf in the morning. Their conversations rose and fell like whispers between waves, soft enough to be absorbed by the walls, leaving only the memory of tone, not content. Some libraries kept watchmen, tasked with staying through the night, but librarians themselves often lingered later than required. There was a kind of attachment that made it difficult to leave quickly. To walk away too soon felt like abandoning something alive, something vulnerable. And so they would sit for a while at heavy wooden desks, writing in their ledgers by lamplight, recording which texts had been borrowed, which had been returned, which had shown signs of wear. Their handwriting was steady, deliberate, meant to endure the centuries. Each entry was a quiet echo of daily life, unremarkable in itself but essential to the continuity of memory. The air of the library at night was cool, carrying the faint sweetness of old wood and ink. The walls, thick and unmoving, held centuries of breath within them, while the floors creaked with every step, as though sharing in the quiet dialogue between past and present. Some librarians wore robes of simple fabric, tied at the waist, sleeves rolled back for ease. Others wore heavier cloaks in colder seasons, their hoods drawn loosely over their heads as they leaned into their work. There was no splendor, no lavish adornment, only garments suited to long hours of care. What dignity they carried came not from appearance, but from the constancy of their duty. And when finally the hour grew late, and their work could rest until morning, they would move toward the exit with the same measured pace with which they had begun. The last lamps were dimmed, the last shutters drawn, and the great halls surrendered to darkness. Outside, the stars gleamed above, indifferent yet eternal, while within, silence claimed the shelves once more. The librarians closed the doors not with finality, but with a kind of trust, knowing they would return with the rising of the sun, to repeat the same motions, the same gentle rituals, the same quiet service to knowledge. For theirs was not a work of endings, but of continuance, carried night by night, as steadily as the turning of the earth itself. When the sun had finally dipped below the horizon, and the afterglow of dusk dissolved into the deeper tones of night, the library stood as a monument of shadow and silence. Its columns stretched upward like the trunks of ancient trees, and its walls seemed to cradle time itself. For those who remained within, the hours after sunset were not empty, but carefully shaped by habit. The librarians did not treat nightfall as an interruption, but rather as an extension of their duty, a quieter chapter of their work that unfolded in slow, deliberate gestures. They would often begin by checking the outer halls, walking in pairs or alone, their sandals soft against the stone. Doors were tested to ensure they latched properly, and windows were examined for drafts that might slip in and unsettle parchment. In some libraries, bronze hinges gave a faint metallic cry as shutters were fastened, while in others, wooden frames closed with a dull thud. To close the library against the night was not merely practical, it was symbolic. It marked the moment when the outside world was kept at bay, and the written word rested within, shielded from wind, water, and chance intrusion. The shelves themselves stood in long rows, like silent congregations. In the dim light of oil lamps, the shapes of scrolls and codices appeared softened, their edges blurred in shadow. A librarian might pause at a particular shelf, running fingers along the spines as though greeting old acquaintances. Some texts had been handled often, their bindings warm from the touch of countless readers. Others had sat untouched for seasons, their parchment stiff, their stories waiting. The librarians treated both with the same care, for they knew that the worth of knowledge was not measured in popularity, but in its survival. The nightly inspection was more than routine. It was a dialogue with the collection. A crease in parchment was noted, a loose thread observed, a faded character memorized for repair on the morrow. Nothing escaped their quiet vigilance. In the margin of their minds, they kept a running list: a lampstand too near a shelf, a scroll whose leather tie had loosened, a codex that smelled faintly of damp. They carried no tools at night, only observation. Repairs, binding, and copying would come with daylight. The night was for watching, for preserving by presence alone. In the larger libraries, where knowledge sprawled across chambers and wings, there was a rhythm to how the keepers moved. One would circle the perimeter, another the central halls, another the alcoves reserved for rarer works. They did not speak unless necessary. The silence was part of the ritual, and to break it frivolously felt almost irreverent, as though disturbing the resting manuscripts themselves. And so their steps and gestures became the language of the hour, subtle yet sufficient. A nod to signal a completed task, a raised hand to share a finding, a pause at a shelf to invite another's attention. Some nights were cool and breezy, with drafts slipping through cracks in the stone, fluttering the edges of scrolls. Other nights were warm and heavy, and the oil lamps smoked faintly in the still air. Regardless of the season, the librarians adapted. They might move the manuscripts further from open windows in summer, or cover them in cloth during the dampness of winter nights. They thought not of themselves, but of the collection. For the texts were more fragile than flesh, more vulnerable to neglect than any man. Their guardianship was measured not in hours but in centuries, and each small act of care became part of that immense timeline. There were always ledgers to consult before rest. At a simple desk, one of the keepers would sit, scratching with a reed pen or quill by lamplight. They recorded borrowings, returns, repairs scheduled, or acquisitions recently stored. The script was steady but never rushed. The ink dried slowly in the dim air, and the pages filled with orderly lines that seemed as eternal as the words they tracked. To leaf through an old ledger was to step backward into the daily life of forgotten years. One could read of a scroll borrowed 3 generations earlier, its title perhaps lost to time, yet its entry still resting calmly in ink. For some, the nightly routine included copying short passages. A librarian might sit with a wax tablet or a spare scrap of parchment, transcribing a phrase from a damaged manuscript before it faded entirely. These were not grand acts of scholarship, but quiet rescues, preserving fragments before they were lost. A few words here, a line there, pieces that might otherwise dissolve with the years. In this way, the night itself became a silent scriptorium, where knowledge was carried forward by flickering light and tired but steady hands. Outside, the city or settlement would often be settling too. Taverns dimmed, workshops closed, streets emptied. The voices of the day faded, leaving only the occasional cry of a night watchman, the call of a bird, or the bark of a distant dog. The library seemed set apart from all this, removed into its own atmosphere. Within its walls, time did not move quickly, it drifted, slow as smoke, steady as the turning of the earth. The librarians felt this difference. They were part of a rhythm older than themselves, a rhythm that linked them to generations before and generations yet to come. Before they departed, they always returned to the lamps. Flames were lowered carefully, never extinguished with haste. Wicks were pinched or smothered, the faint smell of smoke curling upward into the rafters. The last light was often left in a protected alcove, to ensure that embers could be rekindled at dawn. Darkness spread across the halls, gentle but complete. In that darkness, the shelves seemed taller, the walls broader, the silence deeper. It was in such moments that the librarians felt the weight of what they guarded, not in terms of burden, but in reverence. For when the lamps went out, the words remained resting invisibly in the shadows, awaiting another day. And then, with keys or bolts, the final doors were secured. The librarians stepped into the night air, the stars cold above them, the ground cool beneath their feet. They walked home slowly, often without speaking, carrying the calm of the library with them. To those who passed them in the street, they were ordinary figures, indistinguishable from any other. Yet in truth, they carried within them the hush of centuries, the quiet pulse of memory, the devotion of those who serve what others forget. And by the time they reached their dwellings, the library itself had vanished into shadow, yet continued to breathe silently behind its locked doors, waiting for the morning, as it had always done, and as it always would. The hours of night were never hurried inside the ancient library. While outside, the moon moved steadily across the sky, and stars shimmered in slow procession. Within those heavy walls, time seemed almost reluctant to pass. The guardians of the shelves understood this rhythm well. Their lives were not measured by sudden events or striking changes, but by the repetition of countless small gestures, each one almost invisible, yet together forming the very heartbeat of their profession. There was, for instance, the practice of adjusting the shelves themselves. Wood, though sturdy, bowed under the weight of knowledge. A row of clay tablets or stacked papyrus rolls was heavy, and so the librarians would, on occasion, run their hands along the beams, pressing gently, listening for creaks, shifting the order so no single place carried too great a burden. Sometimes blocks of stone were used as supports. Sometimes new wedges of wood were tapped carefully beneath sagging frames. To any passerby, these were the chores of carpenters or servants, but to the librarians, they were part of protecting words from silence. And then there was the nightly sweeping. Dust crept everywhere, settling silently, gathering in corners, nestling between the edges of scrolls and codices. A soft bristled broom was drawn slowly across the stone floor, the sound barely more than a whisper. In monasteries, sand was sometimes sprinkled lightly before sweeping to gather fine particles, then brushed away. This act of cleaning was not a menial duty, but an essential protection. Dust could become damp, damp could invite mold, mold could erase letters, and with letters gone, memory itself dissolved. The sweep of the broom was, in its quiet way, an act of preservation as significant as copying a text. The air at night was often filled with faint scents, oil from the lamps, resin from sealed scrolls, wax from candles used earlier in the evening, the woody aroma of ink blocks resting in their cases. A librarian pausing to breathe deeply might find comfort in these smells, for they were constant companions, reminders that knowledge was always present, tangible, resting close at hand. In the deeper recesses of the halls, where manuscripts lay bundled in cloth, the scent was different. Drier, fainter, almost like autumn leaves. These aromas together formed the perfume of the library at night, an atmosphere impossible to mistake, one that lingered on the robes of keepers long after they had left. Silence was not always complete. In the stillness, one could hear the scratching of mice somewhere within the stone walls. Cats were sometimes kept as guardians, their soft paws padding across flagstones in search of tiny intruders. Some librarians welcomed them, stroking their fur before returning to work. Others viewed them with cautious eyes, for even a friendly creature could cause mischief if too curious about parchment. Still, the presence of animals at night added to the life of the place, a reminder that the library, though built of stone and filled with paper, was part of the breathing world. Occasionally rain fell outside, tapping softly against tiled roofs or stone gutters. Thunder might roll in distant hills, echoing like a drum. Yet inside, the manuscripts lay safe. The librarians took comfort in this, knowing the shelter was strong, the shutters closed, the shelves dry. In desert regions, wind carried sand against the walls with a hiss, but still the guardians within sat calmly at their desks, writing their records, repairing loose ties, or simply watching the flame of a lamp waver and steady again. The act of writing at night held its own magic. A librarian bending over a ledger or copying a fragile passage worked in a circle of light, the darkness around pressing close. Ink glistened briefly before sinking into parchment fibers, strokes slow and deliberate. Mistakes were rare, for haste was absent. Each word seemed to belong not only to the page, but to the moment itself, as though the quiet of night pressed into the letters, binding them with stillness. When they finished, they often let the sheet rest undisturbed, drying fully before it was moved, and then closed the ledger with care, as if placing a thought back into its box. Some nights, the keepers found themselves reflecting as they worked. Surrounded by shelves, they felt the weight of countless voices: philosophers, poets, mathematicians, historians, scribes, each one speaking softly through the fragile medium of ink and fiber. It was humbling to be the caretaker of such company. They knew that their own names would not be remembered, that they themselves would not be written into these texts. Yet they did not mind. The duty itself was enough. To them, it was like tending a garden whose fruit would be eaten long after they were gone. Occasionally, travelers or scholars visiting from far regions lingered in the city and spoke with librarians during the day. At night, when the visitors were gone, the librarians would recall their words, the eagerness with which they sought certain texts, the gratitude expressed upon finding them. It was a reminder that the library was not an island but a bridge, a place where knowledge crossed from one mind to another. And in the solitude of evening, this thought offered quiet satisfaction. They were not only preserving words but ensuring their passage, like ferrymen guiding memory across the river of time. Before rest, it was common for them to sit in the central hall, even if only for a few minutes. There, with lamps extinguished, and only faint moonlight filtering through windows high above, they could listen to the silence. It was a silence unlike any other, neither empty nor oppressive, but full, like a vessel brimming with invisible presence. The shelves seemed to breathe softly, the walls seemed to hum with years of thought. To sit in that stillness was to feel a deep companionship with the past. Some closed their eyes and simply allowed themselves to drift into that calm before rising once more. When at last they departed, their motions were unhurried. Keys turned softly in locks, footsteps echoed down stone steps, and the outer gates were secured. They stepped into the night air with robes brushing gently at their ankles, faces lifted briefly toward the stars. The night sky had always been the library's ceiling, and they took comfort in its constancy. Though they carried no books with them, they carried within their minds the peace of their guardianship, the satisfaction of another day concluded in care. And so, like shadows themselves, they drifted homeward, while behind them the library settled into its slumber, content in silence, awaiting the dawn. The night belonged to the librarians as much as the shelves belonged to the books. It was in these quiet hours that their relationship with the library revealed itself most clearly, not as masters of the place, nor merely as caretakers, but as companions walking alongside it through time. For a library was not only stone and timber, not only papyrus and parchment, it was a living presence, breathing in silence, carrying within it the accumulated voices of generations. And to dwell with it at night was to join in its long meditation, to merge with its stillness until one could hardly tell where the shelves ended and the keeper began. It was customary, in certain traditions, for the librarians to perform a final sorting of the reading desks before departing. The tables, scattered through the central halls, bore the marks of the day's visitors: a forgotten bookmark, a quill left askew, a half-burned candle, a parchment spread wide and not returned to its place. With quiet hands, the librarians restored order. Candles were gathered, their wax carefully chipped from wood. Loose pages were returned to their bundles. Writing instruments were set back in cases. It was a ritual of tidiness, yes, but also of respect. For each object in the library, no matter how small, had a role in the larger work of preserving thought. Nothing was left uncared for. In the great libraries of the Mediterranean, where papyrus rolls were bound with cords and stored in cylindrical jars, the keepers often inspected these bindings at night. The cords, made of linen or leather, weakened over time, and if one snapped, the roll could unfurl and tear. And so, one by one, they checked the knots, adjusted ties, and tucked loose ends into place. It was a slow process, sometimes taking weeks to cover every shelf, but it was never rushed. They knew that a single careless moment could undo months of scribal labor. Better to take a lifetime in caution than a single night in neglect. In the monasteries of Europe, where the codex had begun to replace the roll, the nightly routine often included placing wooden boards upon valuable texts. These boards kept the parchment flat, preventing curling. The monks treated these boards with reverence, laying them gently, sometimes even tracing the shape of the cross upon them as a blessing. In that dim lamplight, the gesture appeared less as practicality and more as devotion, as if the books themselves were brethren resting beneath protective covers. The soundscape of the night library was subtle, yet full of detail for those who listened. The crackle of cooling lamps, the faint drip of water from distant cisterns, the rustle of cloth as a robe brushed along a shelf, all of these became music of their own. To an outsider, the place might have seemed empty, but for the librarians, each sound was a reminder that the library was alive, shifting, breathing with them. They came to recognize these sounds the way one recognizes the creaks of one's own dwelling. A new sound, sharp or misplaced, alerted them at once, for it meant something had changed, perhaps a mouse in the walls or a shutter not properly latched. Sometimes, when the night grew deep, the librarians would pause their tasks and linger by the windows. High above, where moonlight spilled across the stone, they could glimpse the city below, quiet and still. A lantern swinging in the distance, the faint glow of a fire and a hearth, the outline of rooftops stretching like dark waves. All of it appeared softened by the lateness of the hour. In these moments, they felt a kinship not only with the library but with the sleeping world itself. Their work, invisible to most, was part of the same fabric of life that carried farmers in their fields, bakers in their shops, sailors on their seas. Though few noticed them, they felt no bitterness. To remain unseen was part of the dignity of their role. Among the most delicate duties was the care of ink, in small vessels of clay or bronze. Ink sat ready for scribes during the day, but at night it needed covering. Without a lid, it might thicken or dry, or worse, attract dust that would mar a page when used again. So the librarians sealed each pot, wiping the rims, tightening small cloth covers, placing them back in chests. They treated ink not as mere liquid but as potential words, unborn yet waiting. Every drop mattered, for every drop could become a line, and every line a memory. Their devotion extended even to the tools of binding, the knives for trimming, the awls for piercing, the needles and threads. These were stored in order each night, checked for wear, polished when needed. A dull knife could damage parchment, a weak thread could unravel, and so these small instruments received as much care as the manuscripts themselves. It was a philosophy of completeness, nothing neglected, everything acknowledged, for in the web of preservation, the smallest thread was as vital as the greatest volume. At times, the librarians also tended to their own needs within the library walls. Some brought with them simple bread or figs, a cup of watered wine, or a handful of nuts. They ate sparingly in silence, often seated at the very desks where scholars worked by day. Their meals were plain, their posture humble, their thoughts still immersed in their duty. To eat in the presence of the shelves was not indulgence but continuation, as if the act of nourishment were another part of keeping vigil with the manuscripts. The night gradually deepened, until even the faint noises of the city faded. The librarians moved slower then, their gestures more deliberate, their tasks wending toward completion. There was no rush, for the library itself never rushed. It existed beyond the urgency of the human world, anchored in a rhythm as vast as history. To remain in its presence at night was to feel oneself stretched into that same rhythm, moving in longer measures of time, where moments did not press but floated, as leaves upon water. And so the final steps of the nightly routine always resembled a gentle farewell. Each shelf was glanced at once more, each lamp dimmed with caution, each door closed with care. Then, as though tucking a child into sleep, the librarians allowed the library to sink into its rest. They bowed their heads not always formally, but often unconsciously, a small acknowledgement of the place that held so much more than any one life. And when they stepped outside, the night air greeted them with cool clarity. Stars scattered like letters across the heavens, the moon a great pale lamp hanging above. Their homes were simple, their lives quiet. But they carried with them something precious, the calm weight of service, the knowledge that for another day, memory had been preserved. Tomorrow they would rise and return, to repeat the same motions, the same gestures, the same rituals of care. And though each day was alike, they understood that sameness was the essence of their work. To do again what was done before was not dullness, but devotion. It was continuity, the invisible thread that bound past to present, and present to future. And so the night ended, not with finality, but with the promise of return. For as long as words needed guardians, there would be librarians walking slowly among shelves, trimming lamps, sweeping dust, tying cords, recording ledgers, whispering prayers, and closing doors gently upon the silence of history. There were nights when the library felt almost endless, its aisles stretching into shadow as though they had no boundary. The librarians, moving softly between shelves, sometimes felt as if they were walking within a vast forest, each book and scroll like a tree, rooted firmly, yet reaching upward with invisible branches of thought. The air was hushed, and their footsteps sounded muted against stone floors, as though the very walls desired silence. Within this quiet, their nightly routines unfolded with the patience of ritual, unbroken by haste, uninterrupted by urgency. One of their gentlest tasks was the care of parchment. Parchment, made from the skins of animals, was strong yet sensitive to the air. It curled in dampness, stiffened in cold, and cracked if neglected. And so, the librarians ran their hands carefully over pages, smoothing corners, weighing down stubborn bends with soft stones, brushing edges with cloth to keep them free of dust. Sometimes, when a manuscript showed signs of wear, it was wrapped in linen for the night, like a fragile possession needing comfort. This wrapping was not done with ceremony, but with a steadiness that revealed deep respect. Each fold of cloth was pressed with fingers, each knot tied softly, until the book seemed to rest in its covering like a sleeper under a blanket. The ink upon parchment was equally delicate. Certain colors drawn from minerals or plants faded if exposed to too much light, and so the librarians ensured that such works were returned to the darker shelves, away from windows. The faint glow of the lamps at night was kind to the pages, far gentler than the blaze of the sun. And yet, even lamplight could cause harm if left burning too long. Thus, the keepers balanced their need for sight with their duty to preserve, never allowing flame to linger where it was not needed. They worked in small circles of light, beyond which shadows gathered, protective rather than threatening, enfolding the manuscripts in their care. It was not unusual for the librarians to murmur to themselves as they worked, repeating titles or reciting short passages as they checked spines and scrolls. The sound was barely audible, but it filled the air with a human presence, as though the books themselves were answering softly. In some traditions, monks whispered prayers while handling sacred texts, believing that every page carried not only words but also breath, spirit, and intention. To hold a book was to touch not just parchment but devotion, and to return it properly to its place was to honor both its writer and its reader. From time to time, the librarians would pause to rest upon benches placed between the shelves. They did not sit idly, rather, they allowed their eyes to wander slowly across the rows, absorbing the presence of the collection. The shelves were not chaotic, though to the untrained eye they might seem crowded. Each librarian carried within his mind a map of the arrangement, knowing where histories rested, where poetry slept, where medical treatises lay bundled, where records of kings and merchants lined the walls. To sit among them in the quiet was to feel surrounded not by wood and paper, but by a gathering of minds, each waiting patiently to be summoned again. The tools of writing often became part of the nightly inspection. Wax tablets, with their surfaces smoothed during the day, were stacked neatly. Quills sharpened earlier were laid in rows, their points carefully checked for cracks. Inkstones, their basins dark with residue, were rinsed and covered. Even small scraps of parchment were gathered and bound, for no piece was wasted. A single fragment might later serve to patch a hole, test an ink, or bear a short note. Nothing was discarded thoughtlessly, for the librarians knew that memory often hid in the smallest corners, and that what seemed insignificant today could prove essential tomorrow. The night was also a time for listening, not only to sounds within the walls, but to the silence itself. Silence in a library was never empty. It was full of presence, the presence of past voices, the presence of thoughts still alive in ink. The librarians sometimes felt this presence press gently against them, not heavily, but insistently, as if reminding them that the work they did was larger than themselves. To walk among shelves in silence was to walk among spirits, not in fear, but in reverence. The silence was a companion, a guide, and often a teacher. Some libraries had gardens attached, small courtyards where plants grew within stone walls. At night, after their duties, the librarians would step into these spaces for breath. The scent of herbs mingled with the faint perfume of night flowers, and the cool air eased the warmth of the lamps. Looking upward, they saw the stars, vast and distant, yet somehow intimate, as if echoing the countless lights of knowledge resting inside. To them, the garden was not separate from the library, but an extension of it, another book written not in ink, but in leaves and blossoms. Standing there, they felt continuity, between words and nature, between memory and earth, between night and the unbroken flow of time. It was in the garden, too, that some librarians spoke quietly among themselves. Conversations at night were brief, their voices hushed, but sometimes they shared reflections. One might remark upon the beauty of a certain script he had seen that day. Another might recall a passage that lingered in his thoughts. A third might simply comment on the coolness of the air. There was no need for more. Their companionship was as restrained as their labor, marked by gentleness rather than urgency. When the talk ended, silence resumed naturally, like a river settling back into its course. As the hours wore on, drowsiness would arrive, but even then they moved with steadiness. They did not hasten their steps in eagerness for rest, nor did they abandon duties unfinished. Sleep would come soon enough. The manuscripts required their patience, and patience they gave without complaint. Their weariness was quiet, not bitter, a soft weight upon their shoulders that matched the soft weight of the night itself. They knew that in tending knowledge, they were also tending something within themselves, the discipline of care, the endurance of service, the calm acceptance of repetition. And when at last the night was complete, they closed the doors with hands that lingered a moment upon the wood, as though leaving behind a part of themselves. The locks clicked softly, the iron bars slid into place, and the library surrendered to darkness. Outside, the air was cool, carrying scents of earth, smoke, and sea, depending on the city. The librarians stepped quietly into the street, their shadows merging with those of the walls. They walked slowly, never hurried, carrying the calm of their duty with them into sleep, and knowing that the next evening would bring the same rhythm, the same gestures, the same unending devotion to memory. There was a rhythm to the library that deepened with each night, a rhythm that only the librarians could truly hear. It was not a rhythm of drums or bells, but of subtle repetitions. The turning of keys, the lighting of lamps, the brushing of dust, the gentle arranging of volumes. Each action echoed the night before, and the one before that, until the entire flow of days blurred into a quiet continuity. This was their way, and though the tasks seemed simple, they carried within them the weight of centuries. One of the most constant duties was the inspection of scrolls. Scrolls, though elegant, were fragile when handled often. The papyrus fibers frayed at edges, the ink cracked along folds, and the cords that bound them loosened with time. Night by night, the librarians unrolled small sections, checking for signs of wear. They moved slowly, never rushing, allowing the fibers to relax in their hands. If a crack appeared, they noted it, planning to copy the passage at first light. If the ink showed signs of fading, they adjusted its place on the shelf, turning it from light to shadow. Every gesture was measured. Every decision meant to carry the words further into tomorrow. In the colder months, when breath hung faintly in the air and the lamps seemed reluctant to warm the halls, the librarians took extra care with manuscripts. Parchment stiffened in the chill, and so they wrapped certain works in cloth, tucking them gently against the cold as one might cover a child in winter. Their own fingers numbed, yet still they pressed along spines, adjusted ties, and smoothed edges. Their duty did not pause with the weather, for memory was as vulnerable in frost as in flame. And so they endured, their cloaks drawn close, their movements slower but no less deliberate. The nights also carried with them a kind of meditation. The librarians did not seek it deliberately, yet it arrived naturally, as silence stretched and their tasks repeated. To polish a binding, to sweep a floor, to copy a line of text. These acts became prayers without words. Their minds did not wander restlessly, for the library itself absorbed their thoughts, focusing them upon the present. The past was stored upon the shelves. The future awaited in the copying of texts, but the present was in their hands, steady and unbroken. This presence was its own form of peace. There were times when the keepers felt the closeness of history more sharply. A scroll copied generations earlier, its script fading yet legible, seemed to breathe with the voice of a long-dead scribe. A codex bound with worn leather, marked by fingerprints darkened into its margins, carried the silent touch of those who had turned its pages centuries before. In handling these objects, the librarians felt not alone but accompanied. They were walking not in empty halls, but in the company of countless minds, each leaving behind a trace of themselves in ink, in fiber, in touch. The past was not gone. It was resting in their hands. From time to time, small repairs were attempted at night. A loose cord might be retied, a broken clasp adjusted, a corner smoothed. These were not the full restorations done by daylight, but small acts of care, enough to ease the manuscript through another night. Their tools were simple: needles, thread, bits of wax, scraps of parchment, and yet they worked with the patience of craftsmen. They knew that preservation was not grand, but gradual. Each night's care was a single drop of water, but together the drops formed a river that carried knowledge forward. The library's architecture, too, played its part in the nightly routines. High ceilings caught the faint smoke of lamps, allowing the air near the shelves to remain clear. Thick walls kept the inner rooms cool in summer and guarded against dampness in winter. Stone floors, though cold, resisted fire better than wood. The librarians knew these details well, moving with awareness of which chambers were safer for certain manuscripts, which alcoves were more prone to drafts. They did not think of the library as a building only, but as a living environment, one that required constant balance between light, air, warmth, and shadow. Sometimes, during their rounds, they paused before particular works considered especially precious. A text of philosophy that had shaped the thoughts of generations, a scroll of poetry recited in far-off lands, a medical treatise copied and recopied by healers. These were guarded with special care. The librarians lingered near them a little longer, ensuring they were well tied, well placed, well protected. They felt no pride in this role, only humility. For the knowledge itself was greater than they were, and they were only its quiet servants. When fatigue pressed heavily upon their bodies, the librarians allowed themselves moments of stillness. They would sit near the central lamp, hands resting upon their knees, eyes half closed, breathing slow, They did not sleep, for their duty held them upright, but they drifted near the edge of dreaming. In these moments, the line between themselves and the library seemed to blur. The shelves faded into shadow, the manuscripts seemed to murmur softly, and the silence wrapped around them like a cloak. They felt themselves not as individuals, but as part of the long, continuous flow of guardianship stretching across ages. Before departing, they always returned to the ledgers. Each entry was made carefully. The condition of a text, the presence of damage, the notes for copying. They wrote in steady lines, their handwriting plain but enduring. These ledgers themselves became records of history, not the great events of kings or battles, but the quiet events of preservation. To read an old ledger was to hear the voices of librarians long gone, each leaving behind their small testimony. Binding frayed, pages intact, copied one verse. Such details, unremarkable in themselves, built the great chain of memory. And so, when the last lamp was lowered and the final door secured, the librarians stepped into the night with calm hearts. They had done what was needed, no more, no less. The city slept around them, the stars turned overhead, and the air carried the faint scent of stone cooling after a long day. Their work would begin again with the dawn. But for now, they carried only the stillness of the library, a stillness that followed them home and into their dreams. The library itself remained behind, locked in darkness, silent yet alive. Within its walls, the words rested like seeds in soil, waiting for the touch of morning. The shelves stood firm, the manuscripts lay safe, and the air held its breath. And though no eyes watched them through the deep hours of night, the presence of the librarians lingered still, like a soft imprint upon the silence. For theirs was not a duty bound by hours, but a devotion without end, a rhythm that matched the turning of the world itself. As the days stretched into seasons, the routines of the librarians remained unchanged, steady as the stars above the city. Theirs was not a life marked by great shifts, but by repetition, and in that repetition, a kind of serenity took root. Where others measured time by events, wars, or festivals, the librarians measured by the fading of ink, the softening of parchment, the thinning of wax upon a tablet. Time revealed itself in small changes, subtle and almost invisible, yet unmistakable to those who handled the past each night. The shelves themselves whispered of time's passage. Wood swelled and shrank with the weather. Cords loosened, then tightened again, and the scent of dust deepened. Each librarian knew these signs, for their hands brushed against them constantly. They adjusted shelves, wiped corners, and smoothed surfaces, not out of expectation of permanence, but in recognition that care must be renewed endlessly. A library was not a monument fixed in stone, but a breathing space that lived in rhythm with those who guarded it. The evenings always began with a slow walk through the outer halls, where tablets of clay were still kept alongside scrolls. The tablets were heavy, their inscriptions pressed deep and lasting, yet they too demanded attention. Some crumbled at the edges, their surfaces eroded by time. The librarians did not copy these as often, for clay was slower to decay than papyrus, but they did mark which needed support, wrapping fragile pieces in cloth, or setting them gently into carved recesses where air and touch would trouble them less. To walk among them was to feel the presence of civilizations even older than the library itself, their voices pressed into earth and carried forward by fire. As night deepened, their footsteps echoed more softly in the inner rooms, where manuscripts written on parchment and papyrus rested side by side. The air here was heavier with ink, with dust warmed by the faint heat of lamps. The keepers moved slowly, each carrying a small cloth or brush, tools of quiet maintenance. They dusted shelves, straightened rows, tied loose cords, and adjusted stacks that leaned too far. None of these tasks were dramatic, yet each one held meaning. To dust a shelf was to extend a text's life by years. To tie a cord securely was to ensure that words remained bound together, not scattered. The smallest acts rippled outward into centuries. From time to time, their duties required them to copy fragments of fading texts. This was not a task to be rushed, for copying demanded care equal to reverence. They prepared their desks with clean surfaces, steady lamps, and sharpened reeds for ink. Each letter was traced with the precision of ritual, as though the act of writing itself carried a sacred weight. The words did not belong to them, yet they passed through their hands, renewed by the patient flow of ink across parchment. In this way, the voice of the past was carried into tomorrow, line by line, night by night. The sound of writing at night was its own music. The scratching of reeds, the soft crackle of parchment being turned, the faint tapping of knives trimming fibers, these blended into a rhythm that lulled the halls into calm. Even the librarians themselves felt it, as though the act of copying drew them into a meditative trance. Their breathing slowed, their thoughts grew quiet, and the outside world faded. Only the text, the line, the word remained, glowing in the small circle of lamplight. When fatigue grew heavy, they often rose to stretch among the shelves. Their footsteps, muffled by dust, circled back toward manuscripts that needed special attention. They paused before works wrapped in layered cloths, ancient beyond measure. Some were only fragments, bound together to prevent their scattering. Yet even fragments were guarded with equal care, for a few words could carry the meaning of a lost world. The librarian's fingers hovered near, never careless, their touch more like a bow than a grasp. These were not possessions but guardianships, treasures that demanded humility. The air at night was cool, and carried with it faint drafts from unseen cracks in the walls. The librarians knew how to listen for these currents. If one passed too near a shelf, they would shift the placement of scrolls, shielding them with wooden panels or wrapping them tighter. Even the smallest change of air could shorten a manuscript's life, and so their watch was constant. Where others might have seen only stillness, the librarians saw endless, subtle movement, the shift of light, the drift of air, the slow settling of dust. To them, the library was never silent but filled with quiet signals, each demanding care. Their records grew steadily, page after page of ledgers filled with notes. Some nights a librarian would pause, glance back at an older ledger, and read the words left behind by their predecessors. Binding secure, edges worn, copied one verse. The entries were plain, yet each was a voice from the past, proof that the library had always been guarded with the same steady devotion. To read those notes was to feel joined to a chain unbroken by time, stretching far behind them and far ahead. There were also moments when they stepped outside into the night air, if only for a breath. The city slept around them, roofs and walls dark beneath the glow of stars. The air carried scents of cooling stone, faint smoke, and distant water. They did not linger long, for their place was inside. But even this brief step into the world beyond reminded them that their task was not for themselves alone. The city, though unaware, slept under the quiet watch of their labor. Knowledge remained safe, and in its safety, memory endured. When at last the lamps were lowered and the doors secured, the librarians carried home the stillness of their work. Their steps upon the stone streets were unhurried, their faces calm. They had touched the voices of the past. They had guarded them for one more night, and that was enough. No applause met them, no recognition followed them, yet their hearts rested in the knowledge that they had done what was needed. Their rest would be brief, for the rhythm would begin again with the setting sun. But for the moment, peace followed them like a shadow, and within the library, silence returned, vast and unbroken. The shelves stood in ordered rows, the scrolls rested in darkness, and the air settled into stillness. Yet the presence of the librarians lingered, not as sound but as care. Their touch remained in the tied cords, the smoothed bindings, the copied lines. The library slept, but it did not sleep alone. It slept with the memory of all who had walked its halls, all who had touched its words, all who had given their nights to the preservation of thought. In that silence, history breathed. The nights lengthened in memory, one fading into another, until they seemed less like separate passages of time and more like a single continuous stretch of calm. To the librarians, this was not a burden but a blessing, for their purpose was never to seek novelty, but to preserve constancy. The work was not measured by what changed, but by what endured. And so as dusk returned each evening, they resumed their roles as if the previous night had never ended, as if they had simply paused for a breath and now continued the same unbroken vigil. The beginning of each night always felt the same. The first footsteps echoed lightly on the stone floor, carrying with them the weight of centuries. The doors gave their soft groan, neither loud nor harsh, as though even the hinges had learned to respect the silence within. A faint shiver of air slipped past, mixing the coolness of outside night with the stored stillness of the library. Candles and lamps were stirred awake, their flames stretching like drowsy creatures, and slowly the outlines of shelves, scrolls, and arches grew distinct against the darkness. One might expect monotony in such repeated actions, but to the keepers, monotony was a form of peace. The predictability became a steady path on which their minds could walk without stumbling. The act of dusting a shelf was no longer just dusting. It was a small preservation of centuries. The simple tying of a cord was no longer just binding. It was ensuring that a thought, written down long ago, would remain safe against the erasure of time. Even the faint scratches of reed pens across parchment became like a lullaby, a sound woven with intention and patience. The shelves themselves felt alive to those who worked among them. They seemed to breathe quietly, their rows expanding into the dark with a weight both comforting and mysterious. Some shelves held texts so old that even the keepers rarely unrolled them, for the fibers were brittle, the ink faint as whispers. Others contained newer copies, their bindings still firm, their letters strong and clear. To wander the aisles was to walk through layers of time, each step shifting not in space but in centuries. The keepers felt this, and though they did not always voice it, they carried the sensation with them as surely as they carried their tools. A particular ritual often filled the middle hours of the night. A keeper would choose one scroll, perhaps not the rarest, nor the most fragile, but one that had simply waited long enough without being touched. With care, it would be carried to a desk, unrolled halfway, and studied by the soft glow of lamplight. Fingers would trace not upon the letters but along the edges, feeling where the parchment resisted, where it yielded. The text would not always be read in full. Sometimes it was only glanced upon, as if the act of allowing it light and breath was enough to renew its life. When rolled again, the scroll seemed almost to sigh, grateful for its moment of attention before returning to rest. In the deeper hours, fatigue and focus balanced one another. A librarian might pause mid-task, eyes softening, listening to the quiet. Another might let their hand rest on a manuscript, not to read or repair, but simply to touch, to remind themselves of the living presence of the work they guarded. They often thought little of themselves in these moments, for they were only passing figures, and the manuscripts were the true enduring beings. Yet it was this humility that gave their work strength, for their care was given without need of recognition. Occasionally, whispers of history itself seemed to rise. Not literal voices, but impressions, suggestions carried in the atmosphere. While copying, a scribe might sense the faint echo of the hand that first formed the letters centuries before. While walking the aisles, one might feel that the figures of past keepers still moved alongside them, shadows layered with shadows. These sensations were not frightening but familiar, for the library was built upon layers of time, and to walk through it was always to share space with those who came before. The passing of hours was gentle, marked less by clocks than by the rhythm of lamps. One was trimmed, another extinguished, another moved closer to a table. Shadows shifted in long arcs across the stone floor, stretching and folding as the night deepened. The stars outside wheeled slowly, their cold light unseen yet always present. At times, when weariness pressed, a keeper would glance to the high windows where faint silver hinted at their presence. It was enough to know the sky endured above, as the texts endured within. As dawn neared, their work drew to its nightly close. Not all tasks were completed. Indeed, they never were, nor could they be. There was always another scroll to inspect, another copy to make, another binding to strengthen. But the incompleteness was never troubling. It was simply understood that the work was endless, and that this was precisely its meaning. To preserve was not to finish, but to continue. And so, as the first grey light softened the edges of the windows, the librarians gathered themselves. The lamps were dimmed, the dust cloths folded. Scrolls were returned with cords tied neatly around them. Tables were cleared, brushes and reeds placed in their holders. Ledgers closed with quiet precision. The air shifted again, as if the building itself exhaled in relief. Then came the closing of the doors, the final echo of wood against stone, and once more the library sank into shadow. Outside, the city stirred faintly, merchants preparing their stalls, travelers stepping into the streets. But the librarians moved away quietly, their robes brushing the stones, their figures indistinct in the soft light of morning. To those who saw them, they might have seemed like ordinary passers-by, yet within them lay the weight of another night's vigil. They did not speak much as they departed. Their silence stretched with them, a silence shaped by books and shelves and ink, carried out into the waking world like a secret blessing. And as the day unfolded, the library rested, silent and unchanging, waiting for the return of evening, when the doors would open again and the cycle would continue. There was a certain gentleness in the way the keepers thought of time, not as something that hurried past them, but as something that lingered, spreading itself wide and soft like fabric across the hours. Each night was stitched to the next, and the threads that bound them were the quiet rituals performed without fail. The smoothing of parchment, the trimming of a lamp wick, the careful turning of a page, all were not merely actions but repetitions that affirmed their place in a larger tapestry of endless continuity. In the beginning hours of night, when the lamps were newly lit, and the air was still fresh with the coolness from outside, the librarians moved with a steady patience. They carried the weight of their duty not as a burden but as a rhythm, like a heartbeat that one learns not to notice yet always relies upon. To dust the covers of manuscripts was to keep them breathing. To arrange the scrolls in proper order was to ensure that memory itself remained clear, uncluttered, and whole. There were no moments wasted, yet nothing was ever rushed. If a reed pen broke, the keeper would not sigh in frustration, but rather pause, trimming a new point with steady hands, as if the breaking had been expected all along. If a scroll proved more fragile than anticipated, it was not discarded or treated with impatience, but laid gently aside, perhaps to rest longer until new methods could be devised to restore it. Everything had its own time, and the librarians bowed to this truth with calm acceptance. The air of the library at night was unlike any other. It was cool, tinged faintly with the scent of aged fibers, warmed by the slow burning of oil. Now and again, the distant flutter of a moth disturbed the stillness, but even that seemed like part of the harmony, not an interruption. The hush of turning pages, the faint scratch of quills, the soft footfalls on worn stones, all these sounds were so quiet that they blended seamlessly into silence. One could listen and feel as though they were listening to nothing, yet everything. During the long middle hours, when outside the city fell into its deepest slumber, the library seemed most alive. Shadows grew deep, stretching across aisles and shelves, and the glow of lamps created small islands of light where the keepers labored. Within these islands, a reader might lean close to a manuscript, tracing faded ink with careful eyes. Another might copy line after line, the brush or pen gliding across fresh parchment. The words formed slowly, deliberately, as though each carried the weight of history upon its curve. It was not only knowledge that was being preserved, but the act of preservation itself. The faces of the librarians revealed little of wariness. Their expressions were calm, composed, softened by the endless patience their tasks required. From time to time, a hand would rise to rest against the temple, or an elbow would steady itself on a desk. But these were not signs of struggle. They were gestures of rhythm, small pauses folded naturally into the work. The night did not feel long to them, because it was not something to be endured but something to be inhabited. Every so often, one would step back from their task, and simply walk among the shelves. This wandering was not idle. It was a silent acknowledgement of the space itself. The shelves towered like pillars of memory, and as the keepers moved between them, they felt themselves part of something vast. Each title carried its own story, not only within its text but in its survival. Some bore water stains from floods centuries past. Others bore the marks of insects or fire, scars that spoke of dangers overcome. Yet each remained, carried through time by the patient chain of hands that had protected it. The deeper the night grew, the more it seemed that the walls themselves listened. The faint murmur of quills, the distant shuffle of steps, even the soft sigh of a flame adjusting its shape, these were the voices of the library. And though no one spoke aloud, it felt as if conversation flowed constantly, not in words but in the unbroken presence of attention and care. The manuscripts did not call out, and yet the keepers heard them. The shelves did not move, and yet they seemed to lean gently, as though watching the figures who tended to them. When fatigue inevitably pressed its weight upon shoulders and eyes, the librarians did not resist harshly. Instead, they allowed their pace to soften, as though moving underwater. A task might be paused midway, a copy left unfinished, a cloth folded halfway through its work. This was not neglect but simply the natural rhythm of bodies that needed rest. And even in rest, they carried their silence with them. Some leaned quietly against the stone, some rested their heads upon folded arms, while lamps flickered steadily nearby. The library did not mind. It seemed to hold them in its vastness, as a parent might hold a sleeping child. Near dawn, when the stars outside softened into the pale blue of morning, the rituals reversed. The scrolls were tied once more, the tables cleared, the pens cleaned and set aside. Dust cloths were folded and brushes laid neatly in their places. Lamps were dimmed, their small flames pinched gently into smoke. Shadows pulled back as the pale light of day touched the high windows, and one by one, the keepers gathered their robes about them, preparing to step once again into the world beyond. They left the library not with haste, but with the same calm steps with which they had entered. Their silence lingered, carried into the streets like a subtle fragrance, unnoticed by most who passed them. Yet to those who looked closely, perhaps a glimmer of stillness followed them, a trace of the endless patience they embodied each night. The city stirred to life with the clatter of markets, the calls of vendors, the bustle of travelers, but within the keepers, a quiet rhythm endured. The doors of the library closed gently behind them, as they always had, as they always would. And inside, the manuscripts rested again, patient in their shelves, waiting for the return of evening. The silence deepened, wrapping itself once more around the stones, as if nothing at all had happened, and yet everything had been preserved. There is a quiet truth about the keepers of ancient libraries. They belonged as much to the silence as the silence belonged to them. When the evening shadows lengthened and the lamps were lit, their movements were so measured that it often seemed the library had decided on its own rhythm, and they were simply following along. One might imagine the library as a vast clock, not one that marked minutes and hours, but one that turned upon the slow cycles of centuries, and within it, the librarian served as its hands, small but steady, moving gently forward in perfect time. In the still hours after the lamps had been trimmed, the keepers often returned to small, nearly invisible tasks. They would check the knots of the bindings, smoothing cords where they had grown loose. They would adjust the positioning of tablets so that the weight pressed evenly. Even the simplest duties carried with them an aura of reverence, as though the act of straightening a stack of papers were no less vital than the copying of sacred texts. Every gesture was a promise, wordless yet firm, to keep memory alive through their careful touch. There were times when one or another would pause, lifting a manuscript to the lamplight, studying its faded lines with eyes that had seen the same passage 100 times before. It was not curiosity that drew them, nor boredom, but a kind of companionship. The words were like old friends, voices that had not changed though the world outside had shifted countless times. To look upon them again was to feel the continuity of life, a reminder that their task was not new but part of an unbroken chain stretching far behind them. As the night deepened, the air thickened slightly with the mingling scents of parchment, leather, and lamp oil. The faint scratch of a pen could be heard across the chamber, as one of the younger scribes bent close over his work. He dipped his reed carefully, let the ink settle, and pulled it across the page with a steadiness that came from long practice. His strokes were thin, even, unhurried. He knew that his work might never be read in his lifetime, that it might rest in silence for centuries before another hand unfolded the pages. Yet this did not lessen his devotion. If anything, it heightened it, for he knew that the patience of today would be the inheritance of tomorrow. The elder keepers moved slower still, their faces softened by the glow of lamps, eyes narrowed not in strain but in gentle focus. Their hands bore the small marks of long years, Calusa's faint scars from tremming reeds, stains of ink that never fully faded. Yet those hands did not falter. They were steady as they passed over the fragile edges of scrolls, careful as they spread the dust cloth to shield a manuscript from harm. Theirs was a craft learned not in haste, but in the long apprenticeship of repetition, night after night, until each motion carried the calm inevitability of habit. There was something profound in the stillness of these hours, as if the very air remembered the centuries it had breathed within these walls. The stones seemed to lean into the silence, holding within them echoes of every hand that had touched them, every voice that had once spoken here. To sit among the shelves at this hour was to feel oneself dissolve slightly, to become not an individual, but part of the library itself, another presence folded into its timeless watchfulness. Now and then, the faint rustle of robes marked the passing of one keeper as he drifted between rows. His steps were measured, neither hurried nor dragging, the pace of one who walked not to arrive, but simply to move within the space. His lamp cast a soft circle ahead of him, the light touching briefly upon carved shelves, upon titles etched in fading ink, upon the dust that glimmered like motes of gold before sinking once more into shadow. He might pause to adjust a bundle of papyrus, to shift a volume slightly so its spine rested more comfortably, before moving on without a word. Sometimes, the silence was broken by a whisper, though never directed to another. A keeper might murmur a line aloud while copying it, the sound no more than a breath, as if reminding the words that they were not forgotten. At other times, a sigh would slip gently from the lips of one bent long over his work, not of frustration but of release, as though the body needed to exhale its weight before continuing. Such sounds were rare, but when they came, they carried no discord. They wove themselves softly into the fabric of the night, accepted by the library as part of its endless song. Hours lengthened slowly, yet within the library, time did not weigh heavily. The keepers knew the passing of night not by clocks or bells, but by the subtle shifting of the lamps, the way shadows leaned differently upon the walls, the gradual cooling of stone beneath their hands. When the faintest traces of weariness settled into their bodies, they did not resist. They simply adjusted, allowing their motions to slow, setting aside one task to begin another less demanding. The work never ceased, but its rhythm bent gently with their needs. And when the first pale hint of dawn crept across the horizon, invisible yet sensed, the ritual of closing began. Pens were cleaned with care, ink pots covered, scrolls tied once more with cords. Tables were brushed free of dust, chairs tucked back into place. The lamps, one by one, were dimmed until the library seemed to exhale, surrendering again to darkness. Each step of this closing was performed with the same reverence as the work itself. It was not an ending but a pause, the night's chapter written carefully, awaiting the next. As the keepers gathered their robes and prepared to leave, the silence of the library did not break. Rather, it shifted, deepened, as though the space itself was settling into sleep. The doors closed softly, not with finality, but with a patient certainty that they would open again. And in that silence, the library remained, filled not only with words, but with the memory of every hand, every breath, every quiet hour that had passed within. The hours after midnight carried a weight that was not heavy but profound, as if the world itself had quieted to listen. In the library, this stillness deepened, folding itself around shelves and desks like a second set of walls. The keepers, though few in number, moved as though guided by some unseen rhythm, each action slow, deliberate, and filled with unspoken meaning. One might take up a brush and water, moistening parchment that had grown brittle with age. Another might kneel beside a chest, untying cords to check the condition of scrolls stored within. These actions were not urgent, yet they carried the gravity of necessity. For within these fragile objects lay centuries of thought and memory. Each stroke of water, each knot retied, was a way of assuring the past that it had not been abandoned. The air grew warmer near the lamps, cooler by the stone walls. Shadows bent around the figures of the keepers as they drifted in silence. The faintest murmur of breathing filled the spaces between tasks, accompanied by the occasional creak of wood beneath weight. No one spoke, yet the library seemed full, alive with the presence of both living and written voices. The keepers did not think of themselves as alone, for every manuscript was a companion. Every scroll a presence resting quietly in its place. At times, one of them would sit back, closing eyes for a breath, listening not to sound but to silence itself. This silence was never empty, it was vast, endless, like a river flowing with hidden current. To rest in it was to feel part of something larger, something that reached beyond the boundaries of one night or one lifetime. They did not guard the library only for themselves, nor only for their generation, but for all who might come after. The silence reminded them of this truth without words. When fatigue pulled at their shoulders, they welcomed it as naturally as they welcomed the turning of pages. Rest would come in its time, just as work came in its time. And in this acceptance, there was peace. It was said among the elders that a library was less a building than a breathing being. Its breath was the opening and closing of doors, its pulse the flickering of lamps, its voice the faint sounds of parchment shifting against itself. The librarians believed this, not as fancy but as fact. Each night, as they moved within its halls, they felt themselves moving within something alive. To care for a manuscript was to soothe a limb of this being, to light a lamp was to warm its heart. During the deep hours, when sleep had overtaken the city outside, the library seemed most aware of itself. Lamps glowed like quiet stars in the dark, and the shelves cast long shadows across the floors. The keepers, moving gently, gave the sense of caretakers attending to a resting creature, keeping it comfortable through the long night. They wiped dust as one might smooth a brow, adjusted scrolls as one might straighten a blanket. Every action was tenderness disguised as labor. There was no thought of reward. The librarians did not imagine their names carried forward in history, nor their faces remembered. Their reward was the act itself. The knowledge that words which might otherwise have vanished continued on because of their patience. Some texts were never read by any but them, and yet they kept them just the same, for they believed memory had a right to exist even if no voice ever spoke it again. At intervals, one might pause, laying down pen or brush, and step softly to the window. Beyond the glass, stars shimmered faintly, scattered like sparks across the dark. The quiet of the sky mirrored the quiet within. For a brief moment, the keeper would gaze outward, seeing in the stillness of the heavens the same endurance that dwelled in their task. Then, without rush, they would turn back to the shelves, back to the small flame of the lamp, and resume their quiet work. Thus the night flowed onward unbroken, calm as breath. When the faintest grey of dawn began to touch the sky, though unseen from deep within the library, the keepers felt it nonetheless. Something in the air shifted, a subtle thinning, a loosening of the night's weight. Their motions, still steady, began to lean toward completion. Pens were rinsed, their tips sharpened and set aside. Inkwells were covered, lids replaced carefully to preserve what remained. Scrolls, once unrolled for reading or copying, were tied once more with cords and returned to their shelves. Dust cloths were folded neatly, placed where they would await the next evening. The closing of the library was not a dismissal, but a gentle pause, as though the building itself were exiling after long vigil. Each keeper performed these final rituals with the same devotion as the work itself. There was no haste, for haste would dishonor the night. The ending of their duty was as sacred as its beginning. One by one, lamps were extinguished, the flames pinched softly into smoke, shadows deepened as light receded, and the walls seemed to breathe in silence once more. When the doors at last closed behind them, the keepers stepped into the waking world with calm hearts. The city stirred with noise and motion, carts rolling, vendors calling, children stirring in their homes. Yet the librarians carried within them the hush of the night, a stillness that did not break even among the clamor. For though their tasks belonged to darkness, the peace they drew from it followed them into day. Behind them, the library rested, its shelves full, its manuscripts safe. The silence folded itself around the words once again, keeping them hidden yet preserved, until another night came, and with it, the gentle hands of the keepers returned. The night was not a single stretch of darkness, but a series of gentle passages, each with its own quiet tone. In the earliest hours, the lamps burned bright and steady, and the keepers moved with purpose, attending to tasks that required their freshest attention. But as the night deepened, a softer mood took hold, a rhythm less defined by duty and more by companionship with the silence itself. In these hours, the librarians often returned to the simplest gestures. They brushed dust from the corners of shelves, tightened the cords of scrolls, adjusted the tilt of manuscripts so they would rest more comfortably. These were not grand labors, yet they carried a sweetness. The simplicity of the act seemed to mirror the simplicity of breath, of heartbeat, of being alive in the stillness of the world. One could hear the soft swish of cloth against wood, the faint scrape of a chair being moved, the almost imperceptible click of parchment settling into place. These were the sounds of a living quiet, the subtle proof that silence was not emptiness but fullness, rich with the texture of care. Sometimes, when the work grew light, a keeper would sit and simply hold a manuscript in his hands. He would not read it, not in the way one reads for knowledge or story, but simply let his eyes drift across the faded lines, remembering that each stroke had once been alive beneath a hand like his. The words were old, the ink faded, yet they carried within them the presence of another time, another life. To hold such a text was to hold a fragment of eternity, and in that thought, the night seemed to deepen with meaning. The hours stretched quietly forward, and the keepers, without hurry, let themselves be carried by them, as one might drift gently upon a river's current. There was a belief whispered among the elders, never written but always remembered, that libraries were not merely collections of words, but sanctuaries for the spirit of time itself. Time, they said, moved differently within these walls. It did not rush, did not fade, but circled slowly, settling like dust upon the shelves, waiting to be stirred again. The keepers, by their nightly labor, were not simply caretakers of books but companions to time, sitting beside it in its endless rest. During the deep hours, this truth was felt most clearly. The lamps flickered with gentle steadiness, the shadows stretched long and soft, and every movement seemed to belong to another age. A hand adjusting a scroll could as easily have been the hand of a keeper from a century before. A breath let out in weariness might echo the breath of one who had lived and died long ago. The boundary between past and present thinned until it was almost invisible. The librarians never spoke of this, for there was no need. It was not a doctrine but a knowing, something felt in the quiet of their bones. To walk the rows at night was to step into a river that had always been flowing, carrying not just memory but being itself. They were not separate from it. They were part of its current, moving gently alongside. When a keeper dipped his pen and drew a line of ink across parchment, he did so with the calm assurance that he was not alone. Behind him stretched an unbroken chain of hands, each one performing the same act, each one passing on the thread. Ahead of him, though unseen, lay others who would continue the task when he was gone. To know this was to feel peace, for it meant his work was not isolated but eternal. And so the night went on steady and soft, its silence a hymn that required no words. Toward the last hours before dawn, when the darkness had grown most profound, the keepers often felt a quiet tenderness settle into their motions. Fatigue had softened the edges of thought, leaving behind only what was simple, essential. Hands moved more slowly now, not from lack of care but from a kind of gentleness that only comes when one knows the work is drawing to its pause. One keeper might kneel before a chest, laying each scroll carefully inside, as though tucking children into rest. Another might move between shelves, lowering the lamps one by one, the flames shrinking into brief curls of smoke. These were the rituals of closing, carried out with devotion equal to the rituals of labor. There was no sadness in this winding down, only calm. The night had given what it could give, and the keepers had received it with patience. To end was not to lose but to preserve, to let the library breathe again in silence until the next evening returned. Sometimes, in these final hours, a keeper would pause and press his hand softly against the wood of a shelf or the stone of a wall. It was not habit but instinct, a gesture of gratitude, as if to thank the library for allowing them to share in its stillness. No words were spoken, but the meaning was clear. They belonged not as owners but as guests, welcomed into a silence far older than themselves. And when at last the doors were closed and the lamps extinguished, the library returned to its own watchfulness. The keepers stepped into the fresh air of dawn, their robes brushing softly against the stone, their hearts still carrying the deep calm of the night. The city awoke around them, noisy, hurried, full of clamor, but within each librarian there remained a quiet thread of stillness, unbroken, as though the silence of the library had followed them into the day. As the night leaned toward its final stretch, there was a hush deeper than before, as though even silence itself had grown weary and sought to rest. The librarians moved more slowly now, their steps unhurried, their gestures softened by the weight of hours past. The air had cooled, and the lamps burned lower, their light warm but subdued, casting a golden veil across shelves and parchment. One might think fatigue would bring clumsiness, but the opposite was true. The keeper's wariness stripped away all excess, leaving behind only the most careful motions. A hand reaching for a manuscript moved with almost reverent slowness, fingers steady, as though the very act of touching words required devotion. Dust was brushed away not briskly but tenderly, each stroke of the cloth a quiet caress. There was, too, a sense of inward turning. The world outside the library had long since disappeared, and only the enclosed silence remained, a space untouched by the rush of day. Within this circle, the keeper's thoughts grew still, like water settling into calm after a long flow. They no longer thought of tasks or hours, of beginnings or endings. They simply existed within the quiet, carrying out what was before them with a peace that came only from surrender. Sometimes one would pause, sitting with hands folded upon a table, eyes half closed. He would not sleep, not quite, but drift upon the edge of dream, where silence deepened into a kind of gentle infinity. In such moments, the library seemed to cradle them as much as they cradled it, each giving rest to the other. Thus the night thinned, not as something lost, but as something gently released, like smoke rising into air. It was in the last portion of darkness that the library felt most like a dream. The keepers, softened by the long vigil, moved as figures in a drifting vision, their robes brushing stone, their shadows stretching quietly across the floor. Each sound, the faint closing of a chest, the sigh of parchment settling, the murmur of breath, seemed more distant now, as though the night itself were fading into memory even as it unfolded. In these moments, the librarians sometimes felt the nearness of those who had come before them, not as ghosts, not as visions, but as presence. When a hand rested on the spine of a book, it was as though countless other hands rested there too. When a scroll was returned to its shelf, it was as though generations of keepers placed it together, one after another, across centuries. The library was not a house of words alone. It was a house of touch, of breath, of continuity. and in this sense of continuity there was comfort. The keepers did not feel their labor vanishing into obscurity. They knew it belonged to something vast and unbroken, a current of care flowing through time. Whether or not anyone remembered their names was unimportant. What mattered was that the words remained, that silence endured, that the library would welcome night after night, keeper after keeper, without end. The lamps dwindled further, and the air seemed to grow lighter, as if dawn itself were waiting just beyond the walls. The librarians moved through these final shadows with hearts softened, their spirits attuned to the hush that was both ending and beginning. At last, when the sky beyond began to pale, though the keepers saw it only in the faint loosening of the air, they knew the night had come to its close. Their tasks, though never finished, were set gently aside. Scrolls were tied with care, parchment stacked neatly, brushes and pens cleaned and left to dry. One by one, the lamps were extinguished, their flames shrinking into thin wisps of smoke that curled upward and vanished. The library returned to darkness, yet it was not an emptiness. It was a fullness of rest, a deep breath drawn in after long exhalation. The silence settled once more upon shelves and stone, carrying within it the weight of words preserved and the touch of hands that had cared for them. The keepers gathered themselves quietly, robes brushed smooth, steps light upon the floor. As they opened the doors and stepped into the world beyond, the first faint songs of morning drifted through the air. The cry of a bird, the stir of wind, the murmur of life awakening. The contrast was sharp, yet within each librarian lingered the calm of night, the stillness of silence, the steady memory of words preserved. Behind them, the library rested. Its shelves stood watch, its manuscripts waited in their cords, its silence breathed in slow patience. It did not mourn the passing of night, for it knew another would come. Another set of hands would return, another flame would be lit, another silence would be shared. And so the cycle continued unbroken, as it had for centuries. The nightly routines of the librarians were not merely labors of care, but rituals of devotion, acts of trust in the endurance of memory. Their whispered history did not seek to dazzle or proclaim. It simply endured, quiet as the night itself, and in that endurance lay its beauty.